everyone. Welcome to Brown China Summit. My name is Andrew Needham. I'm a junior here at Brown. Today we're very excited to have with us Louisa Lim and Lenora Chu. We're here to discuss Louisa Lim's new and unreleased book, which you might have picked up a copy of, Indelible City, Dispossession and Defiance in Hong Kong, an untold history of the city and its people. Louisa Lim is the author of The People's Republic of Amnesia, Tiananmen Revisited, which was shortlisted for the Orwell Prize and the Helen Bernstein Award. She covered China and Hong Kong for nearly 2 decades as a correspondent for the BBC and NPR. She's also reported for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Guardian. Raised in Hong Kong, she now teaches at the University of Melbourne, Australia, where she lives with her 2 children. And to moderate this discussion, Lenora Chu. Lenora Chu is a journalist, broadcaster, and author of the award-winning Little Soldiers, a narrative account of China's education system. With 20 years of experience in the US, Europe, and China, her work illuminates the intersection of culture, politics, and economy. A passion born in part of growing up to Chinese immigrants in America. She is a public intellectuals fellow at the National Committee on US-China Relations and holds degrees in engineering and journalism currently covers Europe and China abroad for the Pulitzer Prize-winning Christian Science Monitor. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished guests.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here, involved with Brown's China Conference today and supporting the work that the students do to explain China to the public. We are thrilled to have Louisa Lim here. As Andrew had said, she's covered China and Hong Kong for nearly 2 decades, first for the BBC and later National Public Radio. Can't think of anyone else better suited to write about Hong Kong. Let's not forget she wrote The People's Republic of Amnesia, Tiananmen Revisited. Now her latest book, Indelible City, that comes out tomorrow. Is that right, Louisa?
I think so. I think it's the 19th. Is that tomorrow?
19th.
Depends where you are.
Okay, got it. I think that's Tuesday. I know in the US books come out on Tuesdays, but I'm sure there's a worldwide launch planned. And I know that you've been doing back-to-back radio and television interviews for the last 48 hours. So we're thrilled that you've taken this hour and a half to spend with us. Just a few things. Publishers Weekly has called the book a vivid and vital contribution to post-colonial history of Hong Kong. Another reviewer says that the book records the struggle of people oppressed by British colonialism and suppressed by communist China, yet determined in their pursuit of freedom and cultural identity. Anyways, as I said, we're thrilled to have her here today. Louisa, let's start by talking about the genesis of this book project. It looks like it was in part born out of your PhD research. Is that right?
Oh, thank you so much, Lenora, and thank you for inviting me to be part of the Brown China Forum. I'm really amazed, actually, to see so many people on a Saturday night in the US? So it's really nice to see you guys all there. Actually, it was kind of the other way around. It was a book to begin with, and it became my PhD because I got a job at this university and they said, you need a PhD in order to have this position. At this level, we don't have anybody without PhDs, so you must get a PhD. So I was already doing all this research for my book, and I ended up doing a PhD in journalism studies about the way in which local newspapers, both English language and Chinese language, constructed identity in their writing using this character, the King of Kowloon, as an example. So yeah, I'm actually very excited to talk about it because this is probably the first event that I've done with an audience. So, I hope you guys have got loads of questions as well.
Well, you mentioned the King of Kowloon. Why don't you start by introducing that character? It's one that threads throughout the book.
That's right. So the King of Kowloon was this really famous Hong Kong icon who I kind of became quite obsessed by. So he's this elderly, kind of disabled, there's no other way to say it, incredibly stinky old man with sort of quite questionable mental health. And he was very famous in Hong Kong. So he believed that the peninsula of Kowloon had been stolen from his family when it was given to the British in the 1860s. And he spent half a century writing on the walls of the city, not just the walls, the letterboxes, the flyovers, the sidewalks, the post boxes, the lampposts, and he was writing these sort of long screeds where he was writing out 20 plus generations of his family's genealogy and the places that had belonged to them. And sometimes, you know, he'd end it all with these really sweary things like fuck the queen in the arse. And he became this kind of folk hero. He, you know, singers, first rap singers, then lounge singers started singing songs about him. Poets wrote odes to him. He was starred in adverts, including a Louis Vuitton advert for handbags, weirdly. He played cameos in local films, and he became Hong Kong's most valuable artist. He actually even represented Hong Kong at the Venice Biennale, and there's a picture of him. If you've got a book, you can see right at the back, there's this picture of him, and you can see from it the kind of characters that he painted. And that was one of the things that I really loved about him, the fact that his handwriting was just so appalling, right? Anyone who's tried to learn to write Chinese knows how hard it is. And calligraphy is that art which is just so difficult to do well. And he just didn't care. I mean, his calligraphy was, he'd had 2 years of schooling, and you can tell it from his characters, which are, you know, all misshapen and different sizes and whatever. But it became, and I think that was the reason why he became so famous, because, you know, his writing was so distinctive. Nobody else wrote like that. Nobody else, you know, would write in public like that, but he just didn't care.
Now, there was a part in the book where you talk about how controversial it was that, you know, people would actually pay money for pieces of his work. Can you talk to me a little bit about the conflict that, you know, the establishment sort of had towards this artist?
Oh, yeah, the establishment really disliked him. And to be honest, they still kind of aren't. There are many people who still will not recognize him as an artist. And when I started doing my interviewing, I was really surprised at how many people I went to interview who'd say, oh, no, he's not an artist. And I would say, well, you know, he sold a scooter covered in graffiti for $250,000 US. And they say, he's not an artist. And that was, you know, that's still the view among a lot of artists, because they believe that the work that he was doing was not consciously art. And when he had his first exhibition in 1997, it was in it was co-sponsored by the Arts Development Council, which is a government arts funding body, and it was in the Hong Kong Arts Centre, which is a very prestigious place to have it. And, you know, the arts establishment were up in arms. You know, there were people who were telling reporters that he was psychotic, and they were really upset partly because, you know, he was being funded by government funding. And so they thought he was taking up their pot of money, but also, you know, the fact of his writing, it just wasn't traditionally what is viewed as Chinese art. You know, those people teaching calligraphy in universities were just sort of appalled by his calligraphy because it wasn't beautiful, it wasn't learned, it wasn't balanced. You know, it didn't follow any of the traditions of calligraphy. But his curator at the time, a man called Lau Kin Wai, who's quite well known in Hong Kong as a kind of showman, he decided that he would put on this exhibition, and it would really kind of question the nature of art as well. What is art? And when he wrote the exhibition catalogue, you know, he wrote a lot of essays comparing this calligraphy to calligraphy from the 6 dynasties, sort of hundreds of years before, and drawing these classical illusions. And that made the traditional calligraphers even more angry. They thought it was nonsense. And there was a big debate in the newspapers at the time where all the columnists and the they went along to the opening, and it was just kind of quite a circus, you know. The King of Kowloon was sort of painting on a wall and shouting at all the reporters to fuck off, and Lau Kin Wai was telling everybody that this work had all this classical symbolism, and the classical antecedents were this and this and this, and a lot of the reporters were writing that the sort of mutterings of the King of Kowloon and what Lau Kin Wai was saying were equally nonsensical. So it was very controversial at the time. And the curator loved that. He was someone who really enjoyed creating a buzz, and it was probably the most scandalous exhibition Hong Kong's ever had.
Talk to me a little bit about the work, his idea of, writing that disappears, is covered up, is uncovered. Can you talk a little bit about that aspect?
Yeah, so the thing about the King of Kowloon's writing was that the government at the time, he started writing in the 1950s, but throughout sort of British colonial era and later on, the government policy was to cover it up or get rid of it as soon as possible. So after he had written on the walls, it would normally be washed away by government cleaners or maybe painted over. But the King of Kowloon had specific routes that he liked to use. There's a particular bus route 101 for anyone who's a Hong Konger, that he liked to go on. And so he would target the same places again and again and again. He would go back to the same places and paint on the same places. So there are certain places where there's sort of layer upon layer of his writing. And I was also very interested in this idea of appearance and disappearance, because one of the most famous cultural theorists writing about Hong Kong, Akbar Abbas, had this theory that Hong Kong is a culture of disappearance, and Hong Kong's culture only really appears when it's on the point of disappearance. And it seemed to me that King of Kowloon's work was a really beautiful example of this. But I think more than that, for anyone who grew up in Hong Kong at that time, so he died in 2007, but everybody knew him because his work was everywhere, but it was always kind of disappearing and reappearing, and it was just a really familiar sight. And most Hong Kongers at that time, were very familiar. There was something sort of very familiar and homely about his work. It was just a part of the city in so many ways.
Now, did the reaction to him change over time?
Yes, it really did. After his exhibition, so his exhibition didn't really go that well, as you can imagine. It caused this sort of huge stink, and people got really upset. And there was a lot about him in the newspapers, and it didn't sell a single painting, nothing sold, or a single object, because he was also painting on sort of jars and umbrellas and other objects. And a lot of the traditional artists were also very angry about this. They said his work should live, it's meaningless when removed from its ordinary habitat, which is kind of the street furniture of the city. But of course, you can't put a flyover or a lamppost in a gallery, and you certainly can't sell them. And Lau Kin Wai was, above all, someone who wanted to, make things collectible. So there were people who said his work was meaningless and it didn't sell at all. But it did change his status after the exhibition. He became seen more as an artist, and he started to do these other art exhibitions, and they kind of, they became bigger and more international. He did one called The Power of the Word at a very famous gallery, which also featured Chairman Mao Zedong's work, because of course calligraphy, the power of Chairman Mao's calligraphy is something which we still see. A lot of for example, the People's Daily, Renmin Zhibao, the words are written by Chairman Mao, as are many words China's top institutions. So this was a exhibition of calligraphy, and it featured his work, the King of Kowloon's as well. And that traveled to various places. But that curator, a man called Johnson Chang, who's also very famous as setting up, really bringing mainland art to the rest of the world, he wouldn't take the King of Kowloon with him because he said he smelled too much. So he wouldn't take him overseas. But he was doing more and more exhibitions. And then he became, there was this ad in 1999 for a cleaner called Swipe. So it's a cleaning product, and it's a very funny, very amusing ad, and it was a real hit. I mean, so I interviewed Alfred Howe, the man who made the ad, and he described how they made it, and he said, that he thought at the time he wasn't even sure if the King of Kowloon understood what the cleaning product was, but it didn't stop him from shooting the ad, and they just sort of told him what to say, and he repeated whatever they told him, but he'd add his own kind of nonsense at the end. So there were, but this ad also it changed his status. People began to see him less as a sort of, eccentric crank, and more as a kind of almost like a mascot, a sort of lovable uncle who's quite eccentric, because they were seeing him on TV all the time, and it really changed his status. And then he sort of became a commodity. His work was on these fashion collections. You could buy duvet covers and quilt covers and underwear and slippers and aprons with his work on it, and it just became very fashionable. And, that was one of the things that I found so fascinating about him, the way in which, his work spoke to Hong Kongers. People wanted to buy it, whether it was on, high fashion, sort of silk ball gowns, or, commemorative whiskey bottles. It just spoke to Hong Kongers in a way, and I was fascinated by that.
So maybe I'm curious to know exactly what element, what he represented to Hong Kongers, and perhaps you could wrap into that answer your own personal history in Hong Kong.
So I grew up in Hong Kong. I'm not a native Hong Konger. My father's Chinese and my mother's English, but I'm not a native Hong Konger. But I moved there when I was very young, and I spent all my childhood years there. And I went to university in the UK, but afterwards I went back to Hong Kong, and I worked as a journalist there at the local media. So after that, I went to work for BBC and NPR, and I kept coming back to report on Hong Kong and to see my parents. So I've sort of been in and out of Hong Kong for many, many years, for most of my life. And, your question is a good one. What did he mean to Hong Kongers? And it's a question that I really kind of struggled with. I mean, he definitely meant something. And that was really, I really wanted to find out what that thing was. And I think one answer was when he died in 2007. It was all over the newspapers. There were sort of front page articles, and in some cases sort of wraparound supplements with sort of 8 or 9 different full-page color articles about him in the newspapers. And it was really interesting. They all used the same wording, this particular wording, the king is dead, but language reserved only for royalty. And even if it was sarcastic, I think that he did play this sort of really interesting role. All the headlines and the articles said things like, the king is dead, his people are mourning and wailing. The king is dead and his people miss him. The king is dead and we should preserve his ink treasures. So I think there was, in many ways, people saw him as this icon, this kind of figure that was quite representative of many Hong Kong values. Hong Kongers really, there were certain values which are really strong for Hong Kongers. It's, as we've seen with the protest movement in 2019, it's a real values-based society. And one of those is this idea of lion rock spirit, of like hard work and persistence can make you successful. And there's a lot of examples of that in Hong Kong history. But in a weird way, the King of Kowloon was one of those. And when he died, there were newspaper articles saying how hardworking they had been, that he got up every morning at 7 and left the house to paint on the city's walls, and he didn't buy, Gucci shoes or whatever. He was just really hardworking, which I thought was really interesting. So there was that idea, but the other idea that I think is very interesting is the idea that he was the sort of collective memory of Hong Kongers. He became this collective memory that kind of changed the city. So I think there's all of those. But for me, also, I was interested in the content of his writings, and that's something that nobody talked about at the time. When he died, people just thought he was, a sort of eccentric crank, iconic figure, but an eccentric crank nonetheless. But I was interested in the fact that he had been speaking and thinking and writing about territory and sovereignty and dispossession and loss decades before anybody else. So long before that people thought he was crazy. But actually, you look back at those concerns, and they're the same concerns that I think have turned into some of these political movements. And when I went back to talk to these people who knew him, people called him a seer and a shaman and or a prophet and all kinds of things. So I think, there are many different levels to look at what he meant to people. And I'm sure there's a lot of Hong Kongers who think he didn't mean anything at all, that he was totally irrelevant. But to me, that kind of ambiguity, the possibility that also he was kind of quite a cipher. He could mean different things to different people, and his significance changes over time. I think it's really interesting. One I spoke to called him a meme, said he was one of the earliest memes, that his work could mean whatever you wanted it to mean, and I think that's interesting too.
So let's segue into the situation now in Hong Kong. It's maybe the last 3 to 4 months, the international news media's attention has pivoted to Europe with the situation in Ukraine and the buildup of Russian troops prior to that. But, the national security law, the new chief executive, could you give us sort of an overview of what's happening right now?
Absolutely. So in June 2020, after the huge protest movement the year before, Beijing imposed this national security legislation on Hong Kong, which outlaws secession, subversion, collusion with foreign powers, and terrorism. And it's very widely defined, very broadly defined. So these crimes are not really spelt out in any detail, but it has been used a lot. So there have been at least 183 people that have been charged with these crimes. And the kind of things that they've done to be charged for, so 6 people clapped in a courtroom, and that was seen as subversion. There were speech therapists who wrote a children's book about sheep, and that was seen as inciting hatred against the government. People who've had stickers or banners with slogans that have been banned, like Liberate Hong Kong, Revolution of Our Times, which was a very popular protest slogan, that's been seen as subversion. So it's been used very, very broadly and widely. And it's really Hong Kong, since it was introduced, Hong Kong has entered this national security era where national security is the top priority for the government. And, school and university curricula has been rewritten with a national security focus, and civil society organizations and trade unions have been disbanded. Newspapers like the Apple Daily newspaper or digital news outlets have been forced to close down. And the legislature has been completely reshaped. So there've been around 50 legislators from the pro-democracy party who'd had this a primary poll to decide which candidates to field in the election, and that was classed as subversion, and many of them are still awaiting trial. Then the legislature was remade, so it's patriots only. So there's really no opposition anymore in it. There's no pro-democracy candidates because you need to be vetted by a police committee in order to stand. So, you know, it's national security, that is the top priority, and we're really seeing that with the new chief executive, who has not yet been sort of formally appointed, but has been anointed. And it's a man called John Lee, who's a former policeman, and he was the Secretary of Security and in charge of the protest clampdown. And I think it's May the 8th is the moment that he will sort of be formally, have his candidacy formally, you know, be formally announced as the new leader. But he's the only candidate, so there's not a lot of doubt about whether anyone else might get that position. So Hong Kong has been remade. It has been changed by this legislation, and many people have left. I saw figures saying 150,000 people have left since the end of last year. That's partly from the national security legislation and partly because of the COVID-0 policies. But together, these two things are undermining Hong Kong's ability to be an international city. We're seeing the, international companies are also moving their headquarters out of Hong Kong. And sort of most, perhaps damagingly of all, these foreign judges have also withdrawn from Hong Kong's courts, saying that they do not want to be part of this legal system. See, two British judges. So, you know, everything is being changed.
So, Louisa, I think I shared with you before that I was last in Hong Kong January 2020. This was right before COVID, and met with a number of the pro-democracy protesters. And that at that time, they were using the sort of yellow and blue circle economy to identify which retailers were supportive of the movement and which ones were pro-Beijing. So all of that has obviously been shut down. No one's doing that anymore. They had these mobile apps that would identify who's friendly to what side. And I was also sad to see that Ventus Lau, I guess, has been arrested in a number of... Do you know where some of these pro-democracy protesters are being held? Are they on the mainland or are they in Hong Kong?
As far as I know, they're all being held in Hong Kong, but the Yellow and Economic Circle, that thing where pro-democracy people were trying to spend money only at pro-democracy shops, that is for the most part no longer happening. And what instead we're seeing is those very well-known yellow or pro-democracy shops are being targeted under the national security legislation or being shut down. So there's a clothing line that was really well-known for this, and that's, I think they're being raided and targeted in various ways. There were a lot of shops that had Lenin walls in them. Those, and right after the legislation was passed, they all took down their Lenin walls really quickly because it was seen to be possibly subversive. So yeah, a lot of people have been arrested. I think as far as I know, they're all being held in Hong Kong. But the thing that's sort of quite alarming is that many of them, particularly those legislators who were involved in the primary, many of them are still being held without charges, and the way in which they're being held is really alarming. In that they're not being released on bail, most of them, but if they want to be released on bail, they're being forced to sign these agreements saying that they won't talk to the media, they won't use social media, and they're really being muzzled. And the reporting on these court cases is very, very restrictive. So it's hard to know what's going on and what the kind of timeline is for these cases.
The folks that you've talked to who are obviously pro-democracy, what do you think that what are they weighing as they decide whether to leave, whether to stay? What does it mean to fight? How do you fight anymore? What are the kinds of conversations people are having as they debate what to do?
I mean, I think many people who have children are looking at the education system, and that's one reason why a lot of families are leaving, because they're worried that the kind of education that they had, which is a liberal, education which really values critical thought, that's probably no longer possible in this kind of national security era. There's been a lot more sort of propaganda elements that have been injected into the education system. And that's something I think that people worry about. So I think, there are also people who have left because they fear that they'll be targeted because of their behavior earlier on. But I think a lot of people are just quite pragmatic. They're looking at the future of Hong Kong and wondering if it's a place where they can raise a family, where they can have a future. And I mean, I write a lot in the book about history and the uses of history, the type of history that we were taught. And you can see that kind of struggle in the education system being reflected in the way that Hong Kong history is and isn't taught. So in recent years, there've been changes in the curricula that change the way that history is taught. And, the kind of Hong Kong history that is being taught now is much more focused on the mainland narrative of Hong Kong's history. And I think, these are all things that people think about, but they're also looking at the zero COVID policy and saying, well, if there's no way, no kind of exit route for zero COVID, what is our future going to look like? Mm-hmm. Schools have been closed since February. It's April now. How are our children going to get educated? How are we going to make money? And that's, making people very nervous.
Mm-hmm. Now, what about those folks that don't have the option to leave, whether it's, the connections or the resources that they're lacking? Is there a certain resignation about where things are headed, or do you think they're not thinking about it as much? Is there a segment of the population that is just, okay, this is our future, we're going to be wrapped into the mainland much sooner than we thought?
I mean, there's always been a segment of the population which is very pro-China. And we've seen a demographic shift since 1997 with 150 migrants a day coming from China and getting residency in Hong Kong. So that demographic shift means those recent migrants are much more likely to be quite sympathetic to Beijing. And, there's no doubt that there's a certain number of the population, particularly older people, who were really alarmed by what they saw in 2019 when the huge protest movement was underway. There was a lot of violence, and there was a lot of really nasty violence by the protesters who at one point even set an old man on fire. And it was very scary, I think, for many people. So I think, there's a certain portion of the population that supports a return to order and perhaps, sees that as a way forward. And I think, again, particularly older people who just want, to live in peace. For younger people, I think, the fact that millions of people turned out to protest, a 1.2 million in a population of 7 million, that's a significant percentage of the population. I think they're more conflicted, but there are some people who, Hong Kong is their home and they want to stay there. Mm-hmm. And, they will stay there because there's also a value in staying and being able to sort of, see what's happening and report what's happening and be part of what's happening as well.
Mm-hmm. Now, there's a passage I hope you don't mind I read, or would you like to read? It's just a short paragraph on page 260. Do you have it handy?
I can read it. Which paragraph?
It starts at the very last line, "for so long," and then finish up that paragraph.
Oh, yeah. For so long, Hong Kong had been a city untrammeled, except by the limits of imagination. It was a place always in motion, its endless land reclamations creeping outward to displace the sea, its skyscrapers challenging the air itself. Politically, too, it was the living exercise of an impossible thought experiment that held together until it didn't. We'd grown up thinking we had the best of both worlds. Now we were stranded in a completely different universe. We'd imagined this improbable city into existence, and now its very future had become unthinkable, and there was no way to go home. Home no longer existed.
Thank you. It's such a beautiful passage. Now, you mentioned history. Could we revisit some of the things that you have uncovered that maybe haven't been talked about so much? Or, one reviewer said you cast startling new light on some key moments, whether it's the British takeover in 1842, the negotiations over the 1997 return to China. Are there some moments or some pieces of information that you'd like to share about some of your discoveries?
Yeah, absolutely. I was really lucky to find this trove of documents, this archive that people hadn't really found or written about. And in terms of kind of the historical side of this book, that I think is the main contribution. So most of that is in the chapter, I think, called New Territories in my book. And these were interviews carried out by Steve Tung, who's a political scientist at SOAS in London. And he'd done a series of interviews in the 1980s and 1990s with senior Hong Kong officials. So there were some with governors, there were some with civil servants. And the ones that interested me were with this group called the unofficials. And the unofficials were so the appointed members to the Legislative Council and the Executive Council. And these were Hong Kongers who were advising the British government. And when he did the interviews, he said that they should be held for 30 years from the last events described. So many of them weren't released until like the 2010s. And I actually kind of stumbled across them. So it's a really good, it's a good note for students. As I was reading the acknowledgements and the footnotes of Steve Tang's book. So he'd written a book about the transition. It's a really good book. It's called something like A Short History of Hong Kong or something like that. And right at the very end, in the footnotes, he referred to these interviews, and he said that he had been informed by them, but because of confidentiality that he had promised, he'd been unable to quote from any of them. And I was immediately like, wait, what are these? Where are these? So I went off to find them, and they were being held in Oxford, in a library in Oxford. But when I asked the librarians, they gave me a list of the interviews, and it was maybe 40 names on the list. And I actually went to him, I had lunch with him, and I said, are these all the people that you interviewed? And he looked at the list, and he was like, no, actually, I'm sure I interviewed other people. I can't remember who, but I remember I interviewed so-and-so and so-and-so, and they're not on the list. So I went back, and, bit by bit, these interviews kind of emerged. And some of them were extraordinary. I mean, there's a huge trove there. A lot of them have not been used. Some of them have been used, to write about nationality in very specific issues, but a lot of them haven't been used at all. And I just couldn't believe when I started reading them, and I was reading particularly for things about the transition and the joint declaration, which was how that agreement to return Hong Kong to Chinese rule, how it happened and what role Hong Kongers played and what did they think about it. Because, my view was that Hong Kongers their voices were never heard. They had played no part in the negotiations. They didn't sit at the table. There was no referendum. There was no vote on the agreement. And I really wanted to know what these people who had advised the British, what they thought of the agreement. And of course, they'd never been able to talk about it at the time because of the Official Secrets Act. And so, when they spoke to Steve Tang, they just kind of, all this anguish came out. It was like a confession. Some of the interviews were extraordinary. And they spoke about how unhappy they'd been with the agreement, how unhappy they'd been with the British way of negotiating, how they thought the British hadn't understood how to negotiate with the Chinese, how they hadn't, some of them were worried that they actually didn't understand the language because there were no ethnic Chinese speakers on the negotiating team. And then there was this, sort of extraordinary moments, like fly-on-the-wall moments that I found really jaw-dropping. And one example of that was when they first went to meet the Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, in London, right before she went to China to meet Deng Xiaoping in this very fateful meeting in September 1982, and they all went to have lunch with her. And one of the first things she said to them was, how do you expect me to negotiate with the Chinese when we all know they're savages? This kind of incredibly racist language that I think, definitely must have colored the British negotiations, right? And I mean, it was no secret that Margaret Thatcher did not like the Chinese leaders. And when I started, looking for what other people said, one of her closest advisors, Percy Craddock, spoke in quite a lot of detail about how much she disliked the Chinese, how she disliked the Marxist-Leninist system, how she distrusted them. And then when, I started looking at the newly released cables, those themes came up again and again. So it was really interesting. And it was, I think there's just a lot of archival material out there that people haven't really looked at.
Mm-hmm. That's fascinating. So is that one of the hopes of your work? Is that some of these issues are revisited? Well, let's go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be nice. I really do. For me, there's this huge gap in Hong Kong history, and that's the Hong Kong voice, I went to interview a historian called Tim Coe, and he said to me, when I asked him about Hong Kong history books that exist, he said there are no names, no faces for Chinese. And what I was trying to do was to try and, in a little way, fill that gap, to have some Hong Kong voices, really restore Hong Kong voices to Hong Kong's history, because in so many ways it's been a history of the colonizers, just laundry lists of British governors and what they did. So, that was one thing I wanted to do, and I think it would be great to see more research coming out of it. But at the same time, I also understand now that doing research on Hong Kong is actually really complicated by the national security law. It's become a lot more risky. And it is politically sensitive. Any discussion of Hong Kong identity is now something that carries a risk that it didn't before. So, I would love to see it, but whether it's feasible or not is another question, I think.
Now, you mentioned identity, and you quote a sociologist who wrote that Hong Kong identity was now perceived as being in conflict with Chinese identity rather than overlapping with it. In other words, it's sort of, it doesn't really coexist on its own anymore. You cannot have it in this sort of separate sphere. Well, can you talk to us a little bit about that? What are Hong Kongers? How are they parsing their newfound identity? How are they describing this issue of belonging?
Yeah, it's a tricky question, and again, I think it depends on demographics. How younger people see Hong Kong identity is quite different from how older people see it. But there was a moment right after the 2008 Beijing Olympics when Hong Kong identity was very overlapping with Chinese identity. A lot of Hong Kongers were really proud to be part of China. They really, the Olympics, I think, was a real high watermark in belonging to China. And, people saw themselves as both Chinese and Hong Kongers. There were a lot of people who had businesses in mainland China who traveled back and forth. And then over the years, there's been this sort of divergence where, especially amongst young people, where people saw themselves as Hong Kongers and not Chinese. And when it came to the movement, after the movement in 2019, that divergence got bigger and bigger. So something like 0.03% of people between 18 to 29 thought of themselves as Chinese. And that Hong Konger identity became much stronger. But then, there's this question, how do you define a Hong Konger? That's quite a tricky question as well. Because in many ways, some of the people who were political activists and really, really, have played a large role in the movement are people who were born in China, who originally came from the mainland. So people like Nathan Law, who's now in the UK, who was born in China, his family is from China. So you can kind of become a Hong Konger. People have described it as an identity of practice. And then the question is, what is the practice? And, there's been this discussion of Hong Kong as a city of protest. And in many ways, that act of protesting coalesced the identity as an identity that, Hong Kong is a people who were supporting a particular kind of values, sort of liberal democratic values. But during the protest, people were also saying, what is a Hong Konger? One definition was people who've tasted tear gas, because there was so much use of tear gas. And now, weirdly, one of the most sort of detailed definitions of what is a Hong Konger actually comes from the US government, who had this whole sort of breakdown of who could apply as a Hong Konger for, a particular type of residence in the US, and that included all these different kinds of, people with this kind of permit or that kind of permit with permanent ID card. So it's still, it's an interesting identity. It's not sort of cut and dried, I think, in many ways, like other identities are. But, what is the future of Hong Kong identity? That's a tricky question as well. I think it may be that we see these communities in exile that are very activist because they're able to speak and to campaign. And I don't know whether that possibility will be there for Hong Kongers who live in Hong Kong anymore.
So I wanted to wrap up with one more short passage, if you will indulge me, on page 11. So who today are the kings of Kowloon?
Would you like me to read it?
Please.
Oh, okay. So who today are the kings of Kowloon? Are they the ancient clans in their walled villages who were the traditional subsoil owners, or the multinational corporations whose towering headquarters transformed the cityscape, or the Communist Party leaders in Beijing who can impose their will on the people of Hong Kong by fiat and force? Or are they the ordinary people who occupied the streets of Kowloon with their bodies, reclaiming the space-time that is their own? As if seen through a prism, the answer depends on the angle of viewing.
Thank you so much. And I guess, before we open for questions, was there anything I should have asked or anything else that we should know?
I mean, I think you asked beautiful questions. I guess the only other thing that I would say, I'm coming back to my old obsession about the King of Kowloon, is that watch the newspapers. He'll be back. There's a lot of discussion about him now as his work, these hidden works, are beginning to emerge on the streets of Hong Kong. So I think that we will hear more about him in the kind of days and weeks to come. And when they open the big museum called M+, which they've been working on for sort of decades, it was interesting to me that the first piece that you saw when you entered the galleries is this gigantic, pair of doors by the King of Kowloon, covered in his calligraphy, but it's the first thing in the entire museum. So I really think, when I asked the curator why they chose it, they said that, he's front and center when it comes to visual culture in Hong Kong, because it's a visual culture museum. So, I was a little bit relieved that it's not my own particular weird obsession with the King of Kowloon, but other people too.
That's great. Thank you so much, Louisa. Best of luck on the book.
Oh,
with
thank
the
you
book
for
tour and everything. Should we open it up to the larger audience?
Yeah, so this room is all equipped with microphones, so if anybody has any questions, our speakers will be able to hear you. I have a few myself, so anybody to start it up?
Thank you so much for being here. I was just wondering, sort of as a Hong Konger who's also very international, what do you think the international community, the United States, other countries should do, in your view, to help the people of Hong Kong?
Oh, that's a great question. And yeah, when you ask questions, do tell me your name. It's just kind of nice to get an idea of who's asking.
My name is Julian.
Julian?
Yes.
Great. I mean, I think at the moment, the number one issue is not to forget Hong Kong. I think in the sort of horror of watching Ukraine, people are already turning away and forgetting about Hong Kong. But I think what is happening in Hong Kong is something which is, it's underway and it'll continue. So I'd really say the top thing on the list is not to forget Hong Kong. I think there's a lot of lobbying amongst Hong Kong groups overseas, including this idea of some kind of Magnitsky Act. But I would say, particularly for Britain, there's a real moral responsibility, I think, to take Hong Kongers and to, allow them to make lives elsewhere if that's what they, if that's what they want to do. But yeah, I think keeping Hong Kong on the agenda is a really important thing at every level.
Thank you. Would you clarify what's the Magnitsky Act you mentioned?
So it's sanctions. So sanctions against officials who have been involved in human rights abuses. And we've seen sanctions being used really effectively against Russia. So these were brought in, it's named after, there's a American businessman called Bill Browder who he campaigned for the sanctions against Russia in this one particular case involving someone called Magnitsky. But I think amongst Hong Kong exile communities, there's an attempt to pass the Magnitsky Act for Hong Kong as well.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes.
Hello, my name is Dino, and just to follow up on that question sorry, what's your name?
Julian.
Julian asked, there's a voice talking about how sanctions against Russia now isn't really altering fundamentally Russia's activity in Ukraine, but it's hurting the normal people of Russia who might not agree with what Russia is doing. Wouldn't you see that as a problem with Hong Kong too? That the sanctions might be something that hurts the normal people of Hong Kong more than it hurts the government?
Well, I mean, I think there's different ways in which sanctions can be applied. There's no question that the sanctions against Russia, they're damaging. They're damaging for the regime and for the oligarchs, and they may also be damaging for the normal people as well. I think that's certainly an argument. I think it's harder to sanction China, but I mean, we've seen that sanctions be used against certain officials in Hong Kong quite effectively. It's often in the way in which sanctions are applied. So quite early on in 2019, I think, there were sanctions applied against a number of officials for actions in Hong Kong, including the chief executive, Carrie Lam. And it was really interesting. It's the one time that we heard the kind of impact it has had, because you often don't hear that. But in one interview, she let slip that she had not been able to open a bank account or have a bank account because she had sanctions against her. So she had to get paid in cash. If you think about the impact of that, that's actually quite a huge impact, But at that time, I think sanctions were applied against a very small group of people. In my memory, it was about 12 people, and only those most connected, really small circle of officials. So, I think it's in the design of the sanctions. And, with China, it's harder in many ways to apply sanctions, I think. And I don't know that there's political will to do so because of the way, but I think there's one discussion.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dino, for your question.
Thank you. Other questions? I might interject with one of my own, if that's all right. You mentioned a little bit that younger Hong Kongers especially identify strongly as Hong Kongers rather than Chinese, as opposed to what used to be perhaps people identifying as both Hong Konger and Chinese. And I thought it was really interesting that the Hong Kong identity kind of mirrors many countries where, when many countries face adversity, the national identity becomes stronger. And, I thought it was really interesting that in one city you can have that happen. And I just wanted to hear a little bit more about the synthesis of the Hong Kong identity, whether maybe that was centrally led, as it is sometimes in other countries, or if that was, just a very organic thing that happened in the wake of protest movements or in the wake of increased repressive actions by the central government. I just wanted to hear a little bit more about that.
Oh, yeah. And thank you. That's a really good question. It's actually very complicated, Hong Kong identity, because Hong Kong, of course, is the one place which has really, in many ways, been a colony twice over. It's gone from being a British colony to being a part of China. And so this idea of Hong Kong identity has, almost grown up from the grassroots organically, or almost like in opposition to these ideas that have been, that the colonial powers have tried to impose. So, just to give you an example, when I was younger, growing up in Hong Kong, there was no education on Hong Kong's own history. That was never part of the curriculum. Throughout the 70s and 80s, there was nothing at all. And when I looked in the documents, I found, interestingly, the governor, the longest-serving governor, Murray MacLehose, said in the interviews that they had decided not to teach Hong Kong identity because the way in which Hong Kong became British was so shameful in many ways that if people knew how it happened, then they might feel resentment against Britain. If they knew the history of the Opium Wars, that might, change the way they felt about the colonial power. So they just decided not to teach Hong Kong history. And, under colonial Britain, they didn't want Hong Kongers to feel like Hong Kongers because that would make them harder to rule. They also didn't want them to feel very British because then they'd get 6 million people wanting to resettle in Britain, which they didn't want. And they also didn't really want them to feel very Chinese because that could also lead to sort of political problems. So there was this real kind of deracination, an attempt not to allow any kind of identity in particular to coalesce. And, for many years, Hong Kong had been thought of as like a sojourner place where people go and they stay for a bit, they make money, and then they go back home to China or they move somewhere else. So it was kind of a real temporary place. And then, the late 80s and 90s, that started to shift as you're getting generations of people who were raising families in Hong Kong and really seeing it as home. And, part of it was also, the British provided, housing and education and medical care, and it began to be seen much more as a home. And I think as the handover approached, the idea of being a Hong Konger became much, much stronger because, it became... people started to think more about their identity. And then after 1997, that was when you started to see this real organic growth from below. And some of that was there were these early movements, which were preservationist movements, where people were trying to campaign for local architecture, for local preservation. So first it was like the Star Ferry Pier and Queen's Pier, so it's architectural things. Then it was Wedding Card Street, a street where wedding cards were traditionally printed. And then it was a village in the New Territories. So these were sort of preservationist movements, and they used direct action. The earliest was the Queen's Pier movement in 2007, where people were handcuffing themselves to the pier and going on a hunger strike. And many of those people later became people who were part of other movements and became legislators and were quite prominent in the umbrella movement. So that was, there was this kind of growth of local identity that started with a preservationist movement and then kind of moved on to ideas. So in 2014, the umbrella movement was all about wanting more democracy. And then the 2019 movement was to protect Hong Kong's its freedoms as they existed and its way of life. So I think it's a movement that grew up organically, but kind of in opposition to the other pressures being placed on it. So, the clampdown after the umbrella movement in 2019, the more the sense of Hong Kong identity grew. And it's also kind of fueled by the demographic shifts as well. Does that answer your question?
No, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. I remember for myself in high school, the umbrella movement, was big in the news, and it's just very interesting because I remember watching the documentaries of people barely older than myself, so passionate about what it meant to be a Hong Konger or democracy in Hong Kong, and I just, it's really interesting to hear about the synthesis of that. So thank you.
And actually, now you mention it, there was a really important movement in 2012 before the umbrella movement, which was high school students. And they were opposing national and moral education. So the government tried to bring in this kind of like Chinese-style national and moral education, which people saw as sort of Chinese propaganda into the education system. And all these high school students, led by Joshua Wong, who was 15 at the time, they organized these huge protests. And on the last day, a sit-in at government headquarters that, 10,000 students turned up at. And that led the government, it forced the government to withdraw that plan. And I think that was really, really important because it set the tone, and it set the tone amongst young people as well that, in several ways, one of them was maybe working through the legislature is not going to work, but direct action sometimes works. That if you've got enough people, you can change things. And, this sort of extraordinary show of people power amongst the youngest, I think, was also kind of a rebuke for older Hong Kongers, because it was really like all these young people were saying, well, what have you been doing all these years? So I think that was a really, really important moment as well. And I mean, the fact that so many of these movements have been driven by young people is really interesting.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Any other questions? Yes?
Hi, I'm Violet. I was really interested in your brief discussion about the unofficials, the Hong Konger advisors to the British during the transition. Did you get a sense through the interviews that you found and through your research of what specific impacts those Hong Kong voices made on the transition, or is that mostly lost to history still?
It's a really good question, and it's really hard to say. I think one of the impacts that they had was that they forced the British to fight harder. The British had to at least try, they always suspected that the British were doing whatever was politically expedient. And what was politically expedient was just kind of to get Hong Kong out of the way as quickly as possible. But because they kept kicking up a fuss, I think they did force the British, and particularly Mrs. Thatcher, to fight for Hong Kong. And I think that was one impact. Another impact, which I saw, is I think they were the first real, actual local politicians, because this was an era before party politics. But they, and although they weren't part of any of the discussions, they were constantly lobbying. And there became a moment when the agreement was announced and they decided that they were no longer going to stay silent. They'd done their bit. They'd acted with honor, because they were always worried about what was honorable behavior, seeing as they were advisors to the British, and the British had sort of depended on them to sell this agreement that they weren't that satisfied with. And at the moment, they actually kind of stood up, and they had went to Britain to lobby for the Hong Kongers, and they had this whole sort of position paper pointing out all the things that they wanted, all the things that were, wrong with the agreement, and included things like how, what happens if Hong Kongers don't want this agreement, and what will happen if China doesn't, stick to the agreement. What kind of leverage is there? These were all points that the British didn't really want to talk about because it was, unresolved, and they didn't want to have to negotiate these things with the Chinese, so they found it quite embarrassing. But I think that this behavior was quite trailblazing, because for the first time, the Hong Kongers had their own voice, and it was a very specific voice. And they kind of, really stood up and they lobbied. And I think, to me, that was one of their really early impacts, that they kind of set in train this real sort of values-based kind of politics where they were lobbying for an ideal, and even though they didn't necessarily think that they would get it, they were determined to have their say and to be heard. And they were determined to give a voice to Hong Kong. So I think, to my mind, that was one of their impacts, just that they were really visible, an audible Hong Kong voice. And they lobbied, for an idea, even if they didn't necessarily think that it was feasible. And again, that's something that we saw again and again with the umbrella movement and the movement in 2019, is that often people didn't think they would get what they wanted, but it didn't stop them from going out to express, that they didn't think it was feasible, but they still went out and lobbied for it and fought for it.
Thank you.
Do you have any other questions? Yes, Dino.
Can I ask a second question about, so what do you think are some of the practical, tactical, or even organizational lessons that we've learned from the past 10 plus years of protests, of movements in Hong Kong, that we can apply or consider applying, or even consider taking as a perspective in the rest of China? And by asking this question, I'm specifically thinking about Shanghai and the failure of the Shanghai government or the central government in their zero COVID policy in these areas, and the growing amount of dissent that you hear normal people voicing on the internet and other platforms.
Yeah, really good question. I mean, I guess one obvious answer is going to be in information flows. One thing that the Hong Kong protest movement, especially in 2019, really excelled in was communication, like communicating with each other and communicating with the rest of the world. And it was really interesting how sort of live that was, how quickly those communication tactics would change and morph. Lenora, I don't know if you were there on the streets at the time, but it was the ways in which people were communicating. It was like instantaneous. So, they were using airdrop to share information. And sometimes you'd be on the streets and there'd be a crowd of sort of, tens of thousands of people, and then suddenly everyone would disappear, and it would be because there was a message airdropped saying, we're going home now, we're finished for tonight, conserve your energy, come back tomorrow. So the way in which people within the movement communicated with each other, even when, Wi-Fi was down and they were telling each other to use Signal or whatever other tactics, other communication tactics, was one way. But also, I think the messaging to the outside world was quite strong. And it was, it was almost like very organic in that people took on different roles, but they would even have these kind of huge share folders where people would make posters and memes for the next day or the next few days or the next march. And, there were all these sort of massive shared folders throughout that lots of people had access to, and then a lot of different channels on Telegram and various other apps. They also used LIHKG a lot to communicate with each other. And I think that was one of the things that made the movement very live and very kind of mobile, also this sort of be water strategy. And I think it's something that's much harder to do in mainland China because of all the various sort of restraints and censorship. But, I think we are seeing it more, though, in the sharing of videos and the way in which information is circulating now, which I think is more reminiscent of back in sort of 2009 when Weibo was quite active than in recent years when there's been a real sort of stranglehold on information. And I think that's a real indicator of the sort of anger, but also the kind of fear of people on the ground, the kind of, really the desperation of the situation that many people feel in. I don't know. I mean, do you have any other sense of what lessons there are that can be learned?
I'm definitely not well informed at all about the Hong Kong movement, but one thing that I know, I think we should consider is, at least in the case of Shanghai, is that the 20th National Congress meeting is about to happen later this year, and it's not very apparent that there is going to be any policy changes in Shanghai before that meeting, because it will effectively be Xi Jinping saying that he is wrong. And given what he has previously voiced about his participation in his direction of the COVID policies, I think the Shanghai people are in a very hopeless situation. It feels like nothing is going to change, and especially if normal people don't do anything about it, it's a very realistic threat to their livelihood. And in a situation like that, I see sort of small groups organizing in communities and sort of self-help groups forming, and I think that given how the internet, I'm not sure exactly, because I'm not sure how censorship functions really today in China, that I don't know if the online organization that happened in Hong Kong could be used, say, in Shanghai to help the people voice their frustration.
But it's a really good point. And I do think that's one thing that will emerge from what's happening in Shanghai, is at the moment you're seeing these small community groups coalescing to Tuangou, to buy food and buy supplies. But once those communication channels, these groups have emerged, it's going to be quite hard to shut them down, right?
Yeah.
If they start demanding other things or moving on to other things, these groups that didn't really exist before, geographical groups, have already sprung up. So it'll be interesting to see what happens after that, whether, and I think partly also because the government is, I think it's really struggling with this. It's not just Shanghai, it's almost 40% of China's population is now in some form of lockdown. Unless they figure out a better way of dealing with it, it's going to have a massive drag on economic growth. And, all these knock-on ramifications, if these supply and food problems happen in other cities, not just Shanghai, what then? So I do think that element of it, the local organizing element, is interesting, because it's the one thing that ever since 1989 that the government has always tried to avoid, is allowing people avenues for organization. And yet in Shanghai, people have had to in order to survive, in order to buy food and drink and whatever. So, yeah, I don't know what happens to those small communities in future.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Raul, and I'm interested in the certain shifts within the Hong Kong curriculum, because there are several important points. For example, 1997. Because correct me if I'm wrong. Before that, the Hong Kong curriculum does not necessarily include the history of Hong Kong. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay, and then the second shift is 2019, where the national security law has been implemented. So it shifts from teaching Hong Kong history from a more mainland narrative. And so before 1997, the Hong Kong are not necessarily taught to cherish their Hong Kong identity, but after that they started to aware this identity. But in what way and how it differs from because after 1997, it's already technically a part of China, so the curriculum has definitely change or advice from Beijing sort of bit, but it's not like that significant before the national security law has been implemented. And after that, and how this curriculum has been changed to another level.
Yeah, Ralph, thanks for your question. Yeah, you summed it up quite well. After 1997, Hong Kong was supposed to, continue its way of life unchanged, but there were some almost like evolutionary changes in the curriculum. I think for many years, the curriculum has become closer to the Chinese curriculum. There was more emphasis on the history of mainland China, as well as Hong Kong's own history, and I think that wasn't a bad thing. Under colonial Hong Kong, the history that was taught, I think, was very colonial. So learning about mainland Chinese history, I think, could be a really good thing. But since 2020, the shift has been to a national security focus, and not just on history, but across the curriculum. So all the guidelines that have been announced is that even like chemistry and geography, all these subjects should have a national security focus. And that's much more been on teaching a view of Hong Kong history where Hong Kong has been part of China since time immemorial, and that Hong Kong's past is as part of China rather than as, and really downplaying Hong Kong's own specific history. So I don't know how that is going to change in the next couple of years. One indicator is what happens to the Museum of History. So there's a big Museum of History in Tsim Sha Tsui, and after the handover, they closed it and they put together this very definitive exhibition on Hong Kong's history, which was really treading this kind of quite tricky line between the Chinese version and the British version. So it spoke really about how Hong Kong had grown from a fishing village to an international business center, and there was kind of quite a lot about business and not a lot about anything else. And that closed, I think, 2020, and it's due to reopen in the near future. So I think that's going to be a real litmus of how Hong Kong history is taught in future and what is the sort of acceptable way of teaching Hong Kong history. I think the thing that's worrying is that teachers are no longer really have the autonomy to offer different narratives or views of Hong Kong history. That sort of critical thinking aspect has become dangerous, and potentially subversive activity. Teachers are getting actually banned from teaching if they do subversive, they show subversive behavior, and I think that is really worrying because it just shows the narrowing in freedom that is happening in Hong Kong, and it's happening in every aspect of life, but to see that in classrooms, I think it is really alarming.
Got it. Thank you.
Thank you. I believe that's about time. If you guys have any last thing you guys wanted to say.
Well, I'd just like to say thank you for inviting me, and thank you to Lenora for asking such great questions and for giving up time on this holiday weekend. I don't know if it's a holiday where you are, but it's a holiday where I am. But yeah, it's been really lovely to talk to you all, and thank you for your great questions.
A great event.
Thank you. Thank you both for coming to speak with us. It's been amazing. I myself can't wait to dive into my copy of Indelible City. If you haven't already, please grab a copy on your way out. The book's set to release, I believe, in the U.S. on Tuesday. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.